Okay, great. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We've got a really great talk scheduled for today from Professor Varun Rai. So he's the professor of public affairs and mechanical engineering and an associate dean for research at LBJ School of Public Affairs and the director of the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. So he's going to be talking today about reducing solar soft costs, who learns what, from whom, and how. All right, great, Varun. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of the insights we have gathered in this project over the last 3 years. This project was funded by the Solar Energy Technologies Office at the US Department of Energy. And I had some really great collaborators. I know at least one of them, actually a couple of them are online. So Adam Henry from Arizona, Doug Hanna, who was formerly at UT, now at Boston University, Greg Nemeth from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Bill Rand, NCSU, and also Research into Action, which is a consulting firm. What I'm going to do is tell you what we have learned in the last 3 years, and essentially focusing on what are known as solar soft costs. So we'll get into more details of this, but essentially these are the costs of an installed solar system, which are non-hardware. So the non-hardware part of the cost. And essentially we are focusing on how firms go about reducing soft costs as over time they have increased, and how do they learn from each other as they go about trying to reduce these costs. And there are a couple very interesting things that in terms of patterns that happen, and we've tried to understand what those patterns are. The insights overall are going to be relevant for solar in many ways. Solar, as many of you know, solar has had a great time in terms of market growth, but it's really in many ways there is a long way to go here in the US, but across the world. So the insights will be relevant moving forward for solar, but then also increasingly what we're seeing is lots of work need to be done in the building sector. That's going to be a huge focus over the next 10 years in terms of carbon reduction and new technologies that help with that. And so solar combined with building automation, building technologies, combined with electric vehicles, combined with battery storage at the distributed behind the meter. Many of the insights are actually going to be relevant there because there are similar activities. So it's solar, but then insights are going to be relevant more broadly as well. So I already alluded to this. These numbers have only increased in the last couple of years. We started this project in late 2016, 2017, and it's we all know the story. It's really been phenomenal what has happened in terms of solar, in terms of investment, but then also in terms of the increase in generating capacity. So that's a story that is very well known. Something that is actually not fully appreciated is how much of that activity actually happens in the downstream ecosystem, right? So a lot of the installed capacity, roughly 60% or so, is in the large utility scale, but the remaining 40% is in the distributed commercial residential. And even within that, you see a very rich ecosystem. The top 1% of the installers have a large market share over 60%, but there is a 40% of the market share in the distributed side involves over a couple thousand installers as part of it. So there's a lot that goes on, and this is what happens in the neighborhood, right? In your city, in your locality, in your neighborhood, and there are much broader aspects of what this ecosystem entails, and that's been one of the very rich aspects of distributed solar, how it is beyond just a system and the energy that is generated, how it integrates with the community. So there are aspects of job creation, there are aspects of local economies and so on, things that I'm not going to get into today. But it is a rich ecosystem when you look under the hood of what's entailed in the distributed solar systems. The chart you see on the bottom right here basically showing you the long tail of installers. So the y-axis is the bigger chart. The y-axis is number of installations done in one particular year. So this is 2014, but it's similar for the later years also. and you see the x-axis is the rank by installers. So majority of some of the installers, as you see in the inset, they install many systems, but majority of the installers actually install only a few systems, just 5, 10 or so over an year. And when you try to understand what happens to soft cost, how they can be decreased, and for that matter, why they have not decreased that much, it becomes an important part of the story, this distribution of size of the installers themselves. By now you probably, many of you already know, or I've alluded to this, that soft costs, as cost of solar has been declining, much of that decline has been because of costs of hardware coming down, really. And so in that part, you see what is denoted here in terms of the bottom 3 brackets, the yellow, which is module, then the inverter in blue, and the light blue is the hardware balance of systems. And the remaining, the orange and the shaded black, those are typically referred to as the soft costs. They include things like installation labor, overhead, profit, permitting, inspection, as well as taxes and other items. And what you see that over time, while the hardware costs have come down, really soft costs have actually not come down. As a result, as a share of installed cost, soft costs have become about 60 to 70% of the installed costs. And so now increasingly, in the last few years, they have become a focal point of, where does the solar industry, where does the installation industry go from here? And reducing soft costs becomes a critical part of doing that. In this project, we tried to understand the knowledge aspect of how firms go about reducing soft costs. So as a firm tries to reduce cost, it learns over time. And then, that's beneficial for its own installation, but some of that information, some of that learning could actually spill over, and other firms could also benefit. That's the more direct way where, one firm, one installation or one installer is learning from another installer, but there are multiple other possibilities, and we explore all of that, essentially trying to understand how do firms go about reducing soft costs, but then what mechanisms from a learning side, from a knowledge side, are involved in helping them do so. More from I'm not going to make this talk very academic-y, but there are a couple of key concepts that are quite relevant. And many of you actually might already be familiar with them. This notion of learning by doing and knowledge spillover. So learning by doing, it basically entails cost reduction that are gained through experience. So for example, as a firm goes about installing, it increases its efficiency of managing overhead costs, or it might become more effective in converting customers, and customer leads into final sales. So that's you do more, you learn to become better, and then that reduces your costs. And that's learning by doing. And then the second notion is that of knowledge spillover. So a firm did a number of activities, it learned, and it's in its next installation, it will benefit from that learning. But it also could happen, it is possible. It's actually, it's very important in many industries and many markets, that the learning that one firm generated actually spills over in other parts to other firms for that matter. And that's known as knowledge spillovers. There is reason to believe, there is recent work, quantitative work in this area that demonstrates that, including some of the work that we have done and with collaborators, that demonstrate that spillovers are actually quite relevant in understanding how soft costs can get reduced. But that's where the literature actually stops. There's a lot more to understand as to why they happen, what even maybe the barriers are they happening at the level they could be. And that's where really in many ways, this project actually begins, is trying to look under the hood as to what is entailed in learning by doing, and what is entailed and what part of that learning by doing actually might be spilling over. So these two concepts of learning by doing and knowledge spillovers are pretty relevant. It's a little bit of a complex overall key takeaway, and I'll get into the nuances, and there are a couple surprises, and we'll try to explain that. But we do find that knowledge spillovers and this aspect of learning is very important. It can be pretty substantial in terms of its opportunities for reducing solar soft costs. But the successful pathways through which you realize that a firm realizes that reduction is actually complex and non-trivial. So it requires a number of different things to fall in place before those opportunities in cost reduction can actually happen. It's not automatic. There is not a single thing that one can buy. It's not a gadget. Rather, it's a set of different practices. It's a set of different pathways that need to be put together, just like a jigsaw puzzle for this to happen. So great opportunities, but not obvious. And I'll try to shed some light into what I mean by that. I will not dwell on this much, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how we are able to say what we are going to say. So we collect a number of we bring together a number of different data sets, archival data sets. Done roughly 20 very in-depth case studies. Half of them are installers and half of them are other ecosystem actors. So for example, distributors or software developers. We have done an installer survey as part of this. We have, working with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, we have access to the Tracking the Sun data set, which essentially provides very detailed data of distributed solar systems and their attributes. We created a pattern data set. We also have a network data set of how actors in the ecosystem are connected to each other. So we bring all these different data sets to bear to help us understand the learning by doing as well as the knowledge spillovers into this. And I'm happy to answer more questions about these data and our methods more, but I'm not going to dwell too much on those. This is a key chart. It in many ways, and Greg Nemeth, I believe he's on the call. He is the lead on this piece of the study. And it really in many ways sets the tone for what we do in rest of what we did in rest of the project. So essentially what we are trying to understand is, so this is an econometric model we did where the left-hand side, the thing that we're trying to explain is the soft price. So, the price of installed system minus the hardware costs. And, we can compute that and we know that at the system level with some aggregates for some of the variables. And then on the right-hand side, we have a number of explanatory variables, things that we believe are actually contributing in terms of increasing the soft cost or decreasing the soft cost. And those are the things that you see here at the bottom, things like LBD, that's learning by doing, geo spillage, geographic spillovers, firm spillovers. So these are size, system size, market density, and so on. So we have a number of variables that we put into the model. And the model basically then tells us what's happening, what impact these variables are having. And this data set has over 200,000 systems. So it's pretty well powered from a statistical perspective. Again, I'm happy to answer more details on this model. And Greg is there, so he can shed more light. But essentially, I'll zoom out and give you the highlights from what we're learning here. So learning contributes a significant portion, roughly 20%, and depending on what other factors we include, it could be more than that as well. So that's a substantial portion. Why is it 20%? There are other pieces, for example, where are the panels from China, for example. What else may be happening in terms of system size, right? That's the economies of scale that is also contributing. So there are other factors, but when you focus just on the learning by doing and the spillovers, that's roughly a fifth to a fourth of what is possible in terms of solar soft cost reductions. Within that, and so the way these variables are lined up is from highest impact on the left to decreasing impact in terms of the size of the impact these variables have. And so what we find is that learning by doing has the largest impact. So what a firm, and this is not surprising, what a firm does within its own operations. So imagine, if you want to think of a county or a utility roughly as your market, smaller utility, then what a firm does in that market really enables it to reduce costs going forward, reduce soft costs going forward for its future systems. So we find that as important. That the next important factor is the non-local spillovers. So essentially the same firm, but in other localities, in other areas, and that's we refer to that as geographic spillovers, and those are very significant as well. The the spillovers in the conventional sense, the knowledge spillovers from other firms, your competitors for that matter, we have a mixed result on that. I'll get a little bit more into details of that. But essentially, a little bit surprising, we find that spillovers, especially at smaller market size, actually don't have a negative impact on soft prices. So, early on when the market is beginning, or if a market stays small, knowledge spillovers are actually not helping reduce soft cost. But that changes as the market size increases. So I'll get a little bit more into that in a second. And then there are a number of other variables that have different types of impacts. There are a couple of things I want to point out before I head a little bit more onto the deeper insights. One is even within the learning by doing. So, learning by doing, as I mentioned, is, you install more systems and that you learn better and you reduce your costs for your future systems. Even within learning by doing, it's not just that process. There are a couple other things that may be happening. And up until this point, much of the literature, much of the research in this area has looked at learning by doing as just one construct, just how many systems you have installed. In this project, we did some additional work beyond this paper, looking within the hood of what is learning by doing. And other, I'm not going to get into details, but we'll mention that many firms actually, while they are installing and while they may be growing in market size, or for that matter, operating in different markets, they also have different innovation related activities within the firm, right? And that's what we're calling here learning by searching. And that turns out to be significant and takes away, it's correlated with learning by doing, but it's not the same thing, right? It's a different activity. And so that is relevant and significant for that matter. And the second piece of that is learning by interacting. And this really, you have to think about the supply chain. When an installer is installing, oftentimes, they're interacting with the distributors. Some of them actually directly interact with the panel as well as inverter manufacturers. And we find that to be very significant in terms of the opportunities to reduce soft cost. Even that, as you can imagine, the more you're installing, the more you may be interacting up the supply chain. Even that is correlated with, the conventional notion of learning by doing. And we find that, roughly learning by searching and learning by interacting actually account for 40% of what is known as learning by doing together. So overall, learning by doing is very important, but depending on how you want to think about policies, finding these two additional nuances actually have implications in terms of what types of policies might be relevant. But essentially, suggesting that it's market experience and installation experience is one piece, but then also how you think about the innovation process and what it does to learning and cost reductions, and also how you think about the broader supply chain, right? So you have to think more holistically to really see what the opportunities might be for soft cost reduction. So that's number one. The second piece is, little bit more on the knowledge spillovers, right? So that's the third column, and that's the arrow, going from the third. So this is the knowledge spillover column, and what you're seeing here is, as we are plotting here the effect of the knowledge spillover coefficient, right? So we have what you see is kind of a little bit of an inverted U, even though a curved inverted U. So initially, prices, as firms in the ecosystem, as you and your competitors gain experience in the market, for quite some time, this knowledge spillover doesn't really happen, or it certainly doesn't have an impact in terms of bringing soft costs down. But as the market size increases more, and as overall experience in the ecosystem increases, then you see that this knowledge spillover actually starts becoming important and significant and starts to bring soft costs down. So that's actually a surprising finding for us. Normally, the notion is knowledge spillovers will just start to happen, and they will typically have an immediately negative impact on soft prices, which is they will bring soft costs down. And for us, as I'm just demonstrating here, that is not the case. They do have an impact, but later on, not immediately. And so part of our work was to understand why that might be so. And we really think this is pretty interesting. So now getting a little bit into the details of and nuances and some additional evidence of what's entailed in understanding this. One of the things that we encountered early on is when you want to really understand what soft costs are, and you want to devise strategies both within the firm or at the level of a program or for a utility or larger state or national programs to reduce soft costs. Now you really have to understand what soft costs are, and then you can go about measuring them and trying to target different strategies to reduce them. We found that there are multiple different definitions of what soft costs are. Some of them were compatible and some of them were not, and some of them had some pieces and others had some other pieces. So one of the big tasks we did, mostly for ourselves, our projects, so that we could have a common language, but then also for the broader research community, we developed what we call the solar soft cost ontology. So this essentially looks over roughly 200 or so research studies in the literature, and very systematically builds a language of how to understand and categorize different aspects of what's entailed in soft costs. It's the paper is published and all the data and everything is online. So if you're interested, you can play with it. But essentially, for the purposes of this discussion, I just want to highlight that we came up with these 7 high-level soft costs that emerge as consistently important in terms of what is discussed. And then, we break each of these circles is further broken down. So for example, system design, in the ontology, system design has multiple layers. We further break it down in terms of what is entailed in system design. Likewise, for customer acquisition, there are multiple, this oval for customer acquisition has multiple different layers of what's entailed in customer acquisition. So we have these 7 high-level soft costs, and I want to give you a sense of why what I just described in terms of our quantitative results of why knowledge spillovers take some time before they get activated. And so I want to use this to give you a sense of why that might be happening. So let me take a moment to give you a little bit of a framework, and this is an illustrative example to get to the idea. So what you're looking at here is exactly the 7 types of soft costs that I just mentioned to you. So the PII, finance, overhead, labor, design, supply chain, and customer acquisition. Within each of these, I denote by different colors, different ways in which a firm can go about actually handling that piece of the activity. So for example, I give 2 examples here. For example, finance, a firm, an installer could decide that they want to manage the finance or financing of systems through these 3 different ways. They could work with their customers where the customers are buying it. They could work with their customers where the customers are leasing it, or there are multiple different hybrid options. There's not even just one. Actually, there may be multiple ways of doing it. One of them is buying, but with upfront loan that your installer might arrange for you. And there are many other things. But I'm just giving you that there are at least 3 different ways in which a firm can think of managing the finance piece, or for that matter, they could do multiple of these, and some firms actually do. And how you do it over time might change. So for example, a firm might start by doing just buying, but then end up with just doing hybrid, right? So there is this temporal aspect also. But the main point is that just that one piece, the finance piece of yours, if you want to think of this as soft costs, you as a firm can organize in multiple different ways to handle that. And that's denoted by the 3 different colors. Again, this is illustrative, and there could be more or less within each category. For simplicity, I've colored 3 different types for each of the soft costs. Another example is customer acquisition, where there are multiple channels through which an installer might want to do customer acquisition. So door-to-door referrals, or third party, through customer leads, right? And so there are different soft cost categories, and there are different ways of organizing within a firm to tackle those parts of the operation, right? So now let's take a look at some examples of how firms actually go about this. might go about doing this. So here is installer one, and installer one, for example, picks up one particular way of handling PII, another particular way of handling its finance, and so on. So this is this combination, if you will, right? There are multiple possibilities, and for a variety of reasons, it may be who the owner is, it may be what that firm was doing before it's got into solar, or it may be who all got together to begin the firm. That might inform what these choices were. But then, this installer put together an effective series of different things to really get its installation done. So this is what installer one is doing. Another installer might make a different set of choices and still be able to effectively install a system which runs and generates economic and other types of values for a customer, right? And this installer is choosing different pieces of how to do the task, but this combination also does the job. And there's another installer that also picks something else, right? So there are multiple ways of doing this, and that's the key message, right? So think about now. Now let's go back to the notion of knowledge spillovers, right? The idea is that firms will learn from each other. And for them to be able to learn from each other, they should have knowledge that is relevant for them to learn. Now, what is happening here is, in theory, you can imagine that each of the installers might want or might be able to learn from each other in each of the categories, right? So there are 3 installers in this example. There are 7 categories. And so you can imagine there are 21 possible interactions in terms of how learning exchanges could happen. But let's look at the reality in this example, right? And actually, this is not too far from reality. It's part of the point that we're trying to make here. So if you want to look at installer 1 and installer 2, maybe take a second to see how many learning exchanges they can have on solar soft cost period, right, across the 7 categories. I will give you a moment to take a look. And if for a hint is, if the color categories are the same, then they can have an effective exchange. So for an exchange on PII, both of these need to be light blue or dark blue. So that's not happening, right? So I'll move on, but you get the idea. Installer 1 and 2 actually cannot have any effective interaction. Installer 1 and 3 can have some interaction in the finance category and in the design category. And installer 1 and 3, installer 2 and 3, sorry, can have interactions and learn from each other on the PII side. So the whole point is that there was a lot of potential opportunity to learn, but actually how this all is configured and how the different opportunities and possibilities to configure a business in order to deliver a system, how that actually plays out really creates a very thin system or thin development of knowledge that is really not conducive to cross-learning. So that's one of the key insights into why this aspect of knowledge spillover, especially early on, where you're really having installers starting their business without much prior experience, and then really iterating. And over time, you might imagine these evolve to more similar colors. It actually does happen, right? But trying to understand why it takes some time for knowledge spillovers to become active. So that's one aspect. I'm not going to get into this, but another aspect of this, if you want to think about firms, for example, in California and Texas, and might there be opportunities for them to learn from each other? An obvious answer is yes, but keep in mind there are things that these different markets allow or don't allow, or allowed or didn't allow. So for example, in Texas, and for example, taking example of Austin, city of Austin here, for quite some time, leasing was not allowed here. Leasing was allowed more broadly in Texas in the competitive market, but not in Austin. And that would mean that a lot of the work that was happening in leasing in California and for that matter, in other parts of Texas, installers who were operating in Austin really didn't have access, or for that matter, any interest in engaging with that or learning from that. Again, so the point here is that how different markets are constructed and what the different policy pieces are, that also puts another layer of constraint in what is learnable and what might be of interest to learn here. A few things from the case studies. I mentioned we did a number of case studies. One of the things is there are very direct flows, very little direct flows. So going back exactly from this point, but adding a couple other nuances, is firms learning directly from each other is actually doesn't really happen much. It happens in some cases. I'll come back to that. But it doesn't happen much. And perhaps the only effective way through which happens is hiring employees from your competitor. And there are specific reasons of why that might be helpful for certain of the soft cost categories. Something that is very interesting is even in that context, when you think about, and there's competition and competitive aspects involved here, obviously, right? But you can imagine if you could bring in the same environment in an interactive environment, actors who really don't have that immediate competitive pressure, right? So, for example, distributors or installers who are operating in different parts of the US market and really not competing for each other for the current markets that they're operating in. And those could be very effective. And there are some models that have proven to be very, very beneficial for actors that who participate in that. And one of those is this amicus model that brings in different actors who are really not rivals. And then you see a lot of interaction and openness happening in those types of systems. We believe that's a very promising model. Then, in terms of knowledge flows through distributors and manufacturers, I already alluded to that. That is playing out and turning out to be very important, but also something that certainly the research literature has not paid much attention to in the case of solar. It is known to be important in other sectors and industries, but in the case of solar, moving forward, we find that is very important, but there's a lot of opportunity to really open that up. A couple other aspects, and I'll come back to this later in my closing remarks, is the uneven regulatory environment continues to be a source of frustration. And this is not a surprise, but there are a couple of reasons why this is a surprise. I'll come back to that perhaps in the next bullet. But it also turns out that what happens really in a smaller market setting and the different nuances associated with that market setting actually turns out to be competitive advantage for local firms. You have to know to be able to do business there, and it just works that one way. And that, while it is a source of frustration and leads to inefficiency, it also is in some ways good for local firms who do have that knowledge in terms of operating in the local environment. So really, interesting trade-offs associated with efficiency, as well as, what it really means for market structure. And in particular, the geographical aspect of that market structure. Where are these firms actually coming from? Creating software solutions for streamlining business processes. So one of the things we find that is very interesting is, as you'd imagine, as the market has started to grow and started to mature in some ways, a number of software providers have developed solutions that would help manage projects and project flows, as well as post-installation aspects, and streamline that. And that's absolutely fantastic. It plays a very important role and will play an important role. One of the issues, though, is exactly this fragmentation. So it has been known that market fragmentation and differences in policies and regulation, it hurts, but generally the reason why that was understood to be the case is, you have to know from an installer's perspective now, the understanding of why that is a barrier was because looking from the lens of an installer really has to keep track of all of these, do their paperwork rightly, have their processes according to these, and so on and so forth. What we are finding is, as the market moves on, there are these solutions that are trying to come in, third-party solutions, right, that zoom out from one installer and looks across a suite of services across installers. And that's great, because then you can internalize a lot of those issues and really streamline it. As you try to do that, it turns out that there's still exactly the same fragmentation aspects are hurting development of those types of software, because then you really have to customize your products a lot, and that it has huge implications for how you develop software, how you upkeep it. And so there's a whole different reason, and I think it's moving forward. It's a more important reason why we need to pay more attention to removing and standardizing across different areas in a way that can really help development of the software. Something was not well understood before. Something else we find a little bit surprising is this aspect of customer education continues to be a source of cost, which is not necessarily captured by the in the initial parts of the installation process. And what this, of course, it is known that customer acquisition and the interaction with customers and trying to help them understand what installing will mean for them and the process itself, that's known, that's been known. What this is referring to is the post-installation process, right? And if you have a business that is based off of referral, for that matter, a lot of installers, actually, especially smaller ones, continue to have their business based off of referral. It is very imperative to have continue your interactions with your customers and managing that process post installation, and that continues to be a cost. It doesn't show up in any piece of the install price, but it is a cost for the firm's cost of doing business. It indirectly shows up in your overhead or customer acquisition. So these are other very important nuances that we're finding. I already alluded to the fact that direct interactions and knowledge sharing through direct interactions between the installers is actually not a big source. You're seeing that same insight here in a different fashion, where on the right-hand side, these are the 7 different soft cost categories, and then this is more like your you have seen these types of diagrams for energy flows. What's your primary energy flow, and where does it go to? And we have tried to do the same thing in terms of how knowledge flows. And on the left-hand side is who the interaction partner is. So the yellow column or the yellow stack is basically if the interaction was with direct competitors. The orange one is with non-competitors. The green one is non-solar sector actor. And the blue one is the trade organizations. And then the different flows basically say what those interactions were with. We don't have to go into details here, but a couple things you can just take out. Much of the interaction and learning that installers are having in this ecosystem is from non-competitors. So that's the orange stack right there. But some of it is happening through direct competitors also. I'm not going to go into details, but it's very interesting. And we have tried to think about this. Very interesting to see when are direct competitors actually sharing with each other in something you'd not expect to happen, but it does happen. In particular, I would point out permitting, inspection, and interconnection, the PII piece, as well as the supply chain piece. I'll give you a hint as to why we are seeing more direct interactions there, and it has to do with how much of a cost you can manage internally, how much you can improve your own processes, how much of your learning by doing can really help you manage your own cost, and how much of those costs actually might be a collective problem. And no matter what you do, it will have zero impact or very little impact on the broader costs that you're exposed to. And PII is one of those, right? You can manage part of that within, but it also is what your utility or other regulatory bodies relevant to this sector might be doing. And so as one installer, you wouldn't be much effective. So that's where you try to organize and share and trying to bring those costs down. It's very interesting how this all is trying to play out. So the main point here is that non-competitors, right? So these are the other ecosystem actors. So your distributors, third-party providers, and if you expand that to other actors of the ecosystem, they are becoming more and more important in how knowledge is really flowing into the system. So if you're a researcher, paying more attention to that is going to pay off a lot. And also likewise, if you're an installer, trying to keep an eye as to how your interactions with these other parts of the ecosystem really is helping you better understand the knowledge and then imbibe that into your own products and services. So I'll in the next 5 minutes or so, I'll try to wrap up. I have alluded to much of this already, so I'm not going to go through this, but essentially standardizing definitions of soft costs. I think it's we are 15, 20 years into this, really phenomenal growth of solar, but we still don't talk the same language. At least the solar community should, and we have provided the basic platform to do so. It's all open, it's public. It should be one common language. It can be improved, and it will improve, but there is a core basis for how we should talk about this in order so that we can learn better from each other. I mentioned that the variation in business practices and variation in regulatory and utility processes, they continue to be a big source of barrier for reducing costs, soft cost. Not in the way it was understood before. These things have been known before, but what we are finding is there are much richer, deeper reasons why these are acting as barriers in the past, but why they will continue to be barriers into the future also. And this is my last but one slide, where essentially, what should be done in terms of trying to reduce soft costs? So what are our overall takeaways here? Focusing on the overall ecosystem. As I mentioned, this is hardware. If you reduce cost of your panels, and that's one thing. It's a big piece, but you just buy it and put it in as an installer, right? But as an installer, reducing soft costs is no simple task. It's really multifaceted. I showed you the 7 big categories, but each of them have further nuances. How do you really go about tracking all of that? All right, then you are interacting with your customers, but then also with your manufacturers, distributors, financiers, and others, right? And much of that turns out the sum of it really what contributes to soft costs or soft cost reductions, if you will. So really one has to look at it from an integrated, holistic ecosystem and not as an individual piece, because no one individual piece is really that important, for that matter, very tractable either. Fostering experience, I mentioned, this notion of how spillovers become important, but only at large market sizes. And it means that, especially for smaller firms and for smaller markets, there is good reason why support should be provided, right? And a variety in different forms. But unless that happens, a very important, powerful force of knowledge spillovers actually doesn't occur until larger market sizes. Looking for opportunities to standardize, I cannot belabor that more, but the big insight here is that in new ways we are trying to, we find that in new ways this aspect of standardization is becoming more and more limiting, and as a result more and more important to really break that part of the puzzle. And then finally, continuing to interact and educate with the customers. This piece is actually going to get more complicated as we see, as I mentioned, home automation, battery storage, including now perhaps thermal storage in some cases, geothermal possibilities in some distributed cases, and so electric vehicles obviously. And so it's becoming a suite of different technologies that customers are getting activated toward and are starting to think about this. And it's not just solar, right? And solar is there, it's pretty prominent, but it's now a part of it. And how do you engage in that conversation as an installer when you're trying to put maybe target installing just the solar system? And so how that interaction plays out and how costs associated with that are accounted for and managed will continue to be very important. I'll leave you with this slide. This project is just a piece of work we have been doing in my group for the last 10 years or so. And some of the topics we've covered range from all the way from decision-making economics to incentive design, innovation networks, and modeling at the population scale from bottom up. So I'm very happy to share with you PDF. Please send me email. So I'll stop there and see if there are some questions.
Great, thanks, Varun. That was really great. So we have some time for some questions.
And Brian, how do you want to do the questions? Should folks just speak up or type in their questions?
I would say just go ahead and speak up. If you want to use the chat, we can ask the question if you want to write it in. But I think feel free to just speak up and ask away.
Hey, Varun, Scott Wynn here. I'll take the first crack at a question here. Towards the very beginning, towards the early, one of the early slides, I just wanted to see if you could get a little bit more of a breakdown a bit on the potential cost reductions from, with one of your slides you had the 20% potential cost reductions for in soft costs, that the both from learning by doing, but and also from spillover. I'd like to understand a little bit better, because I was a little bit confused, how much of that 20% is broken down, both in terms of how much was for by learning by doing, and then how much was from the spillover, knowledge spillover. And then second, you also had, like, within the learning by doing, you also broke it down further, and it was still called learning by doing, but then learning by, I think, sharing, and then learning by innovating.
Right.
So you could just provide a little bit better kind of quantitative breakdown on that. And then maybe I've missed, and then my second part question, which is, can you give some examples of learning by innovating? Some examples of what that could look like for these installers.
Sure, no, absolutely. Great question, Scott. And, I know Greg is there, but if he wants to chime in, I welcome Greg to do so. The learning by doing, I agree with you. There is a lot of detail there, right? And even the 20% actually depends on, where on the spectrum of that variable you are, right? So it changes from whether you're looking at 5th percentile to the 95th percentile of the variable. So there's a range there. Within that 20%, if you look at that chart, so let me very quickly see if I can go back to that chart right here, right? And I will have to share my screen again, right here. Okay, so even here, you see that, just the learning by doing itself is the largest portion of that, what we're attributing to learning, right? So, in some cases, it will dominate the entire 20%, right? Depending on what the other variables are. So for example, if you are in a situation where the market size is large and market experience by the installers in the ecosystem is substantial, at that point, firm spillover can actually start to become significant also. So you will start to see trade-off, right? So it will not be accurate to say that just one of them is necessarily the king, but a large part of that is being attributed to learning by doing, especially in beginnings of the market. So I'll say that and see if Greg wants to add anything to that. To your second, Greg popped in for a second. Greg, do you want to say something?
No, I thought you did a great explanation of it, Varun. I appreciate the question too. So yeah, that's, if you had span that full range of going from the worst learning experience, which is not having much, to having lots of experience, you get that 20 cent cost reduction. The other thing, just in terms of implications of this, there was a report I think came out last week from Solar Energy Industries Association about the installs being down in the second quarter and employment down as well. And I talked to a reporter about this yesterday, and I was saying that this will bounce back because demand will increase again, and a lot of those people just get rehired. But what I'd be most concerned about is losing some of this, because this is all that those processes that Varun has been talking about and the knowledge that's been gained. A lot of that is tacit knowledge. It's in people's heads, and so if they're laid off and start to go into roofing projects or something that's not solar anymore, some of this gets lost, and so that's part of the value that we're talking about here, is subject to the market being volatile as it is right now. So there's gains to be made by experience, but also there's something fragile about it. And so one of the implications is trying to find ways to preserve that knowledge, do some of the codification that Varun has been talking about, and potentially share among networks so that people leaving because of employment trends doesn't lead to the loss of this knowledge here. So
great. Thank you so much, Greg. Let's see if there are any other questions.
Varun, I had a question about tariffs. I guess how maybe it's complicated, but I'm curious how the tariffs, like in the United States, have affected the soft costs.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Brian. I would say the tariffs impact largely more directly the hardware costs, right? That's what they are geared towards. They do flow back to soft costs, and we have not tried to study those impacts in our study, but I could two parts to the answer. Number one, they flow more directly to the hardware costs, and second, more from the distribution aspect and business process aspect. If you're having to shift your supply chain and your inventory and how you're getting your materials and supplies, at least for certain parts of time when these things take effect, for a few months or some time of that scale at least, you can also see those flowing into soft costs. But we have not tracked those types of relationships directly in the project. Any other questions?
Varun, I just had one final question then. Is you showed a plot of the relative soft costs versus the other costs, the inverter and that sort of thing up to 2018. Has that I guess equation or proportionality for the different costs, has it changed in the last 2 years?
It is fair to say that it hasn't changed too much. It's in the same ballpark region.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Great. All right. Well, thanks again, Varun, for the talk. It was fantastic. We'll have it recorded on our YouTube channel. So for those of you who watched, you want to watch it again or let your colleagues know, that would be great. So thanks again, Varun, and we'll see you all later.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining.
Yeah. Bye.
Thanks, Varun. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.